just be aware we distribute those only to members that request it because they weren't able to attend this session. So today we're covering off on various topics. Basically, we're trying to stay away from COVID-19 today because everybody's got a little bit of COVID-19 fatigue. If any of our members want a separate briefing on COVID-19, please contact us at any time. Obviously, our daily East Asia, our daily South Asia major development roundups are covering off it. That's why we withdrew the specific by country roundup. We found that it was just getting too laborious, so we're including it back into the major daily roundups now for both sub-regions. So basically today we're going to be covering off on various issues, the China-India issues, Hong Kong and the relevance of the Greater Bay area and how that may play into the political landscape as the US-China tiff has more and more relevance to the security paradigm in Asia. We'll also be just covering off on the Korean Peninsula and also a little bit on the Indonesian resource sector. We may or may not cover off on PNG if we get time and if there's an interest there. But please, I might ask Bhargav initially to just go ahead and just basically cover off on the USA and China dynamics affecting the region. You've gone too far there, mate. Righto. Too far the other way now, mate.
Hello, everyone. This is Bhargav Reddy, the Regional Operations Director for APAC Assistance. I basically head up the information services and other affiliated services across Asia Pacific for APAC Assistance. So going further, I'll be covering off on the India-China border disputes, which has been flaring up in the last month or so. Okay, I wouldn't be getting in detail about the border dispute in itself and the history behind it, because beyond a certain point it becomes inconsequential. But what is of consequence to businesses is that the trade between India and China is as high as 89 to 90 billion dollars, and it is largely in favor of China, with about $69 billion deficit in favor of China, of course. But now, why is this important, especially with the backdrop of the border dispute, especially after the news came out about nearly 20 Indian soldiers who were killed at the Galwan border? Just for reference, this is a line of actual control, or the border between India and China. Okay, Galwan border is somewhere along the border in Kashmir, Kashmir or Ladakh, however you know it. But why is this dispute really important? Given that two of the major economies in the region are at each other's throats, it does cast a dark shadow over the trade as well. Now, due to nationalistic jingoism, at least in India, there have been quite a few businesses who have vowed to stop their imports or stop their businesses from China. For example, probably one of the largest bicycle manufacturers, Hero, has stopped its imports from China, valued all the way up to 900 million. Now, at the same time, Indian government has taken quite a few stern steps against Chinese activities within India. For example, they have banned over 59 mobile applications very recently. Now, granted that 59 of those, maybe about 4 to 5 of those apps were quite popular, and rest were fairly third-rate applications. But some of those apps include TikTok, UC Browser, Share It, which were quite popular in India. At the same time, it had a deep impact on other aspects as well. For example, India hosts a very large chunk of Tibetan refugee population in India, and they use WeChat, which got banned. It was among the 59 apps which got banned, and now their communication with their families back in Tibet has been cut off, because in China they don't use WhatsApp or any such apps as well. Now, it is quite hypocritical for China to to be upset over such ban, because I mean China itself doesn't allow some of the biggest software companies to operate openly in China, like no WhatsApp, no Facebook, no Google. So their response was comparatively muted, because they do understand it is quite hypocritical of them to to complain. Now, what does it actually reflect in big picture? So this could actually disrupt, if the imports are disrupted, with many traders actually backing off from dealing with China, or Indian government taking pretty anti Chinese steps, or even perfunctory steps like banning these apps. It is likely to affect some of the manufacturing sectors as well, because imports may not really come directly from the companies who actually need those implements, but it goes through a third party as well. And if they don't really deal with Chinese suppliers, their supply chain will be disrupted. Okay, so in the bigger picture, it is likely to have a major impact on businesses in India. Now, coming to investments as such, Indian government's stance, especially from past 6 to 7 months, has been quite stern and quite anti-China as well. They have taken steps to limit Chinese investments and shareholding within Indian corporations too. So it may not really have a direct impact in terms of operations, day-to-day operations, but it does have a direct impact on corporate structuring, right? So though the border disputes date back to 1950s, which actually erupted in a full-scale war in 1962, it does cast its shadow today on corporate sector. Paul, any questions on that? Paul, I think you're muted.
I am indeed. I don't have any questions. It may be good to just cover off on a couple of the macro USA-China issues, not just specific to the border.
Yes, thank you for that. Yes, the US has taken a pro-India stance in this dispute, actually. In fact, Pompeo even commenting that they may even consider banning some of the Chinese apps. Now, US is trying to be opportunistic, but their own response has been equally perfunctory. You do not really see any strong, tangible steps taken against China, except for basically giving a lip service in support of India. In fact, lauding India for standing up to Chinese aggression in the region. Now, China and the US have been at each other for a while now, and they have been battling each other on multiple fronts. In fact, Anshika will cover off on South China Sea, and there is Hong Kong front, wherein Mansi will come in on that. At the same time, we need to also see another angle. Of course, it's quite a conspiracy theory that there have been theses being written on how Chinese engineered the entire global pandemic to take advantage of the instability in the region. But of course, there have been quite a few contrary arguments to that as well, because probably the worst hit after the US was China in the entire pandemic scenario. But what this border dispute does is actually fuel into that global, larger picture, bigger picture of USA-China rivalry across the Asia-Pacific region. Paul?
Yeah, so look, thanks, Bhargav. I think what we want to do now is, and we're trying to answer off on the questions you all sent in that you want us to cover. We did a separate session on the Hong Kong or the impact that China's and the US TIF's likely to have given the scenario in Hong Kong. But we noticed there was a lack of knowledge on the Greater Bay Area. So I might just ask Mansi, if you will, to cover off on the Hong Kong and China Greater Bay Area. Bhargav, can you advance the slide? Thanks. Thanks, Mansi.
All right. Sure, Paul. Hello, everyone. I'm Mansi. I'm a research assistant at APAC Assistance, and I'm based in Mumbai. So I'm going to begin with a brief context on Hong Kong and the political situation there. And from there, I will be moving on to the Greater Bay Area. So to begin with, there has been a renewed wave of unrest in terms of widespread protests in Hong Kong after a brief break in protests due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Demonstrations have increased in frequency since the relaxations of measures taken by the Hong Kong government to curb the spread of COVID-19. The first wave of protests, in fact, started in June last year when the extradition bill was up for deliberation. The proposed bill would have allowed authorities in Hong Kong to extradite fugitives wanted in mainland China and other territories. While the bill was later withdrawn on September 4 last year, mass protests have continued in Hong Kong since then. Excuse me. So this later transformed into a call for demands for democracy. It grew popular within the supporters, the pro-democracy supporters in Hong Kong. And there have been like mass arrests since then. These protests have often turned violent with instances of clashes erupting between the police and the protesters. Hong Kong has relatively been unstable in the recent months, especially because the Beijing administration has introduced two laws. The first being the national anthem law. It criminalizes any insult to the Chinese national anthem, and anybody who is found guilty of doing the same could face up to, or rather faces up to 3 years in prison and hefty fines up to $6,000. And the second one is the national security legislation, which came into effect on June 30. It effectively criminalizes secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with any foreign and external influences, which could potentially threaten the national security of the region, and especially China. The maximum sentence for violating the law is life imprisonment. And it will also allow the establishment of mainland security agencies in Hong Kong for the first time, besides extradition to mainland China for trial. So the passage of these two laws are likely to increase crackdown against anti-government forces in the territory. And under the law, the authorities could potentially deem any criticism of the establishment or any anti-government sentiment as an act of secession or subversion. This will likely increase crackdown against anti-government forces. And similarly, pro-democracy supporters are especially vulnerable under the current law. And they could, like I mentioned earlier, they could potentially face longer jail terms and extradition to mainland. And this has largely disrupted businesses and supply chains in the financial hub that is Hong Kong. And despite that, protests are likely to continue and may possibly spill over to other regions in Hong Kong itself. Well, and the major implications from this are that the US has on many occasions threatened to revoke the special trade status it shares with Hong Kong. Meanwhile, Hong Kong will, as a result of this, Hong Kong could face economic implications. So basically, revoking this special status would open up a range of options, like from visa restrictions of Chinese diplomats, asset freezes for top officials, to possibly imposing tariffs on goods coming from Hong Kong. This would effectively mean that the US will treat Hong Kong no differently than any other Chinese city. And this decision has the potential to affect both the economies. And moving on from this, I will speak about the China Greater Bay Area. So this is a project which is aimed at putting together the Hong Kong, Macau, and 9 other cities in mainland China, including Guangzhou. The authorities plan to forge a new economic region, which is comparable to other city clusters such as the San Francisco Bay Area, Greater New York area, and the Greater Tokyo area. The goal of this project is to strengthen cooperation among these cities, and especially by focusing on each city's competitive advantage. This will also help create a system in which they all can complement one another for greater outcome. This integration would enable China's infrastructure and connectivity programs like the Belt and Road initiatives as well, and strengthen the supply chain in higher tech manufacturing services. And there are some important key projects that have been undertaken in under this project. Those include the Hong Kong Zhuhai Macau Bridge, which initially opened in 2018 but was recently inaugurated, and it aims to significantly reduce travel times from Hong Kong and Zhuhai and Macau. And the second project is the Express Link, which also opened in 2018. It connects Hong Kong to cities like Shenzhen, Guangdong, and subsequently to China's vast high-speed rail network. And the third project is the Shenzhen Zhongshan Corridor, which is expected to be completed in 2024. It will be an 8-lane highway project, which will reduce travel times between important cities such as Shenzhen and Zhongshan, Jiangmen by approximately 30 minutes. It is estimated that the Greater Bay Area also produces 48% of the country's total exports and accounts for nearly 12% of the region's inbound tourists. It is it is the fastest growing region in China, many times exceeding 16% growth. Do you have any questions on this, Paul?
No, I don't have any questions. Does anybody have any questions? And if anybody wants a full coverage of the Greater Bay Area, we've got some very interesting statistics comparing it both on travellers, also container movements, so that you can see the significance of it and how capable China is of depowering Hong Kong as a critical gateway to the West and actually re-empowering other cities. Are there any questions?
Hi, Paul, it's Jamie. An extension of the Great Firewall to the sort of Hong Kong area, is that a likely scenario?
I'm going to deflect that to Anshika or Rugger, if I may.
Anshika, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, could you repeat that question, please?
Yeah, an extension of the Great Firewall to Hong Kong, is that a likely scenario?
Or do we think it's already occurring?
Well, yeah.
Rugger?
Well, recently we're seeing some companies actually pull out of Hong Kong, saying that the national security law that's been recently implemented will actually threaten them. So while the Great Firewall, there is no indication that the Great Firewall is going to come in place, even including Hong Kong, but it looks like there will be more data monitoring, and a lot of Hong Kong citizens have reportedly even erased a lot of their past history and their data just to make sure that they're safe from the reach of the law.
Jamie, I might add there, and this is really a professional opinion rather than a piece of analytical work, but I think it's fair to extrapolate that given the statements that various, HSBC's made and a couple of the other high-profile banks have made, that there's certainly pressures to bear from the Chinese government. That combined with the new security laws would indicate that companies would be prudent to plan on the basis that their data there is currently or soon to be compromised. I think the integrities of the communications in Hong Kong, it would be best to be erring on the side of cautious prudence.
Thanks.
Okay.
So Paul,
yes,
Tony Lugg, it's Tony Lugg.
Thank you. Just if guys, you can say your organisations. Sorry, Jamie Jemison was Conogo Phillips. Tony's. Go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, Chairman of TAPA Asia Pacific. So look, I'd just like to get some opinions here in terms of the manufacturers in the south part of China. As you know, Hong Kong's been a significant gateway.
Yes.
So what is everyone's views on this? Do they foresee that where companies are perhaps moving out of Hong Kong, that this is going to create some issues in this arena? I'm trying to really join all the dots together as already has been said. I think there's going to be a lot of, I can see a lot of fallout from this. And already, I don't know if everyone has seen that survey or surveys floating around on LinkedIn. You know, it appears that, you know, there are a number of companies looking to move, if they haven't already done so, already in the process of doing so. And of course, obviously, I think there was Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, and even Kuala Lumpur as, you know, the sort of relocation bases. So in terms of the trade flows going into Hong Kong, I suppose what I'm asking is, what does everyone think that impact would be?
Yes, so Tony, look, I think not just the flows of cargo that TAPA would be particularly interested in, but the integrity of data, tourism, all of these issues are going to be affected. It's our assessment that the biggest factor affecting the ongoing tiff between China and USA is obviously going to be what happens in the election in November, and whether if our greatest friend, Mr. Trump, doesn't get re-elected, whether it will add some sobriety to an otherwise seemingly drunken brawl. Obviously, the USA first, or USA only as it's becoming, if that continues to go down the path it is, it's going to have a much greater effect on Hong Kong than if there's a change of government in the States and a move back towards diplomacy, which means all the things you mentioned, companies moving, China depowering Hong Kong, China growing the Greater Bay Area, China making a point that two countries, one system doesn't mean that 1.4 billion people are going to curtail to less than 10 million. And when we look at the significance of the Greater Bay Area in terms of Chinese GDP, and when we look at the Greater Bay Area in significance of particularly how small it is compared to how much that GDP is, and also how small Hong Kong is as a part of the wider Greater Bay Area, it becomes evident that China's not as vulnerable as the Western world thinks. So whilst the Western world's pushing its values, it's obviously a futile case. Now, obviously, you know, there's an ongoing tiff now with Australia. There's been Australia supporting America as its ally, but doing so on values when its major trading partner is indeed China, not the States, has put Australia in a vulnerable position. They probably haven't handled that diplomatically well. And today we've seen China retaliate against an Australian travel warning that you need to be careful if you're in Hong Kong and consider leaving, or if you're going to Hong Kong, understand you could be arbitrarily detained. China's come back and laughed that off as ludicrous. So the ongoing escalation is not only pertaining to America and its actions, but America's pressure to its allies. Thus, it's going to be critical how the States' election goes, because I think we can take as an assumption Australia is not going to change its diplomatic skill base. It's very good at negotiating, and the comprehensive economic partnership agreement with Indonesia took 10 years to set, and that was an example of really strong diplomacy by Australia, very skilled diplomacy. But when it comes to Hong Kong, I think, you know, the election's going to be critical, because everything's stemming from the pressure that the existing administration's placing on other allies and Trump's hungry quest to get re-elected. So I think we're going to see, and again, I haven't taken this down to the analytical processes, but we're going to see companies readdressing their position based on data security, based on the values that are going to change. We're going to see companies that need to be in Hong Kong as an entry point to China being submissive or complicit with China for that reason. Companies that aren't so using a regional base, that are not so dependent on that China market, may want to hedge their bets. But again, I'll emphasise that companies are going to make decisions regardless of what governments think and regardless of the Western values companies sadly, are going to make those decisions based on the economic necessities to them. I did see the survey that TAPA published, and also the other ones you're mentioning on LinkedIn, and I think we're seeing that as well in those trends. It might be an interesting thing for us to task our analysts to produce a piece on that, but I can't see other Taiwan, KL are not going to benefit as much as Singapore, simply because the Singapore location, its reputation at a regional level, combined with its very good government to deal with from a business perspective, and also the low or the relative low tax rates are extremely attractive. So look, I hope that answered your question there, Tony. On the logistics side, it'd be actually interesting for TAPA or us to put out a survey to see the severity or the number of companies or the change in their own logistics at this point as an indicator.
Yeah, you know, actually, Paul, I was going to suggest doing that because, look, I think everything you said is valid. But one of the point I was going to sort of ask you is, you know, at some point, you know, after COVID starts to die down, I can imagine there's going to be, you know, some COVID invoices being sent across the world, and you know, from some of the rhetoric we've heard, obviously the US will be using that as part of their trade negotiations, and I suspect, you know, maybe
Yes.
France, Germany, and some others will also be looking to you know, to obviously make some form of recovery. So, do you see that, or maybe it's too early to even discuss that? But is that worth looking at, Paul? That or that sort of impact, whether that would actually you know, create potential trade wars, you know, as you say, the tiff going on with Australia at the moment. And then, of course, then when you start looking at the impacts to the markets on that, you know, that's potentially significant, isn't it?
It is, it's enormous, but we have to just for a moment think about it from not only the various countries that have made comment, but think about it from China's perspective. Because a disease initiated in our country, how we communicated it when WHO had full access, and you're trying to apportion blame, it's going to be hard to see that as anything other than bullying. When you look at stripping away potential blindness to one's own values and think about it from the other perspective, there may be an impact, but separating off the reality of how tangible a case that is and international law and the facts that they're going to base that on, I think it's really hard to ascertain how it's going to unfold, and therefore very hard to extrapolate impacts off. I do think a lot of the rhetoric or emotional claims are dependent back upon the American position. And I think we also have to throw in there a big slice of how rational is the complaints against China, given, and my apologies here for any American citizens on the call, but the atrociously inept responses in locking down America and the control. So it's hard not to see it as a lot of serious deflection going on now. That doesn't detract from your point, Tony, that the impacts are going to be significant, but it makes it very, very hard to quantify the scenario. You'd have to mount several scenarios and then extrapolate from those scenarios. So I think it's premature to do that. And sadly, I don't think we're even going to be in a position to do that until we see which way the election's going. You know, early polls are indicating we're going to see a change in government. The flip side of that is Trump has an incredible capacity to point the finger at false news while being the world's greatest proponent at creating it. So he's very clever at manipulating the media, and manipulating easily malleable sectors of society in the States. So the fact that he can influence voters in an adverse way, but Trump's a master of knowing if you've got a doctorate of philosophy or if you're an unemployed guy with 17 weapons, you both have one vote. So he's quite masterful at actually understanding the critical nature of manipulating one man, one vote systems. Okay, so look, we're spending a little bit too much time on that, but I think we're going to have to task our analysts to look into those issues.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Anyone else got queries there?
Yeah, Paul, Joel Keegan here from SAP. Just one quick question on that. Regarding the Chinese political elite, any indications from the Chinese perspective on their preference for the result in November in the US elections? And if it is for a Donald Trump return, what do you think is the capacity that they would have to accentuate what they are doing in the Hong Kong area, the Greater Bay Area here right now, as a, to help that China as the boogeyman story along to help Trump's election? Is there any correlations there, do you think?
Mate, it's a hell of a good question, and probably take 2 hours to answer it adequately, because the real point there to hone in on is when you say the Chinese elites, what you're referring to. Now, let me anticipate that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you fundamentally got, the Politburo and the Chinese Communist Party, but you've got more powerful entrepreneurs from various, I want to say oligopolies, I'm not sure that's the right word, but emerging entrepreneurs that perhaps are at odds with the Communist Party. And are you referring to both of those halves of the wedge, or only one?
I think I'm talking more about the political elites who would be looking at the redistribution of the balance of power as the as the world superpower.
Yes. So on that, Keegs, I think that the Chinese elitists want Trump to lose power because they actually want to be dealing with something that's half rational. We know, if we look at the political landscape of the State Department in America over the last 3 decades, it did get overly powerful in its views. It has hurt its reputation in terms of the whole claims of weapons of mass destruction, which we know that was either a situation that was poorly appreciated or it was concocted for political beliefs or for commercial gains pertaining to oil. But it's not really in China's interest to want to see Trump get back in. He's breaking down of free trade policies. He's archaic and short-sighted views in terms of economic principles is something that's not in their best favour. Now, I don't know if any of our team want to add something, Bhargav or Raghu or Anshika. Would you disagree with me there? Bhargav, do you wanted to talk, or Raghu or Anshika?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I kind of agree with you as well, because it's an evolving scenario, and how things devolve out of American elections is fairly unstable at the moment. So bigger picture, I do agree with you.
Yeah, and look, I'm not sure, Keegs, if your actual question is asking whether China or other states, or obviously Russia, but even, the Soviet bloc nations, whether they're going to try and manipulate the election. Were you actually angling down that
Yeah,
path?
Paul, I have it because I was having some conversations with folks, some Chinese guys here in Singapore, and there was the opinion that the political elite would be looking to, a Trump re-election could possibly be a favourable for them from that perspective of the shift of the balance of power. But certainly, to your point, from a business elite perspective, I would suggest they do want to have sensible people with which to trade at a business-to-business level. So that's the angle I was coming at from what I've
Yeah, Keegs, I'm not sure. I don't actually understand why they would think that the political elitists would want Trump to be in, or how that would advantage China, because
Yeah.
I think the emotion, the energy and effort going into dealing with the Trump for Trump campaign is something that I can't imagine the Communist Party, the political elites, the Politburo wanting to go in. I don't know if anyone else on the audience wants to comment.
Well, the thing about Trump is he's always willing to cut a deal. So I can perfectly see him talking to Xi Jinping and saying things like, look, I'm going to badmouth you over the next 6 months, but it's an election. Let's get over that. And when I get re-elected, let's sit down and do a deal. Yeah,
the flip side of that is Trump at best thinks 1 year ahead or the next election ahead, whereas China's thinking 50 to 100 years ahead. I think they've probably got a degree of exhaustion now in dealing with Trump because he's so quick to renege. There's no point cutting deals with somebody that reneges, isn't consistent. So I just can't see it. I look forward to being corrected down the path, but I think we'll put a little bit more effort into that, thinking about that in some greater detail. Okay, is there any more questions there? If not, then I might ask Anshika to just cover off on some of the other tensions, South China Sea and whatnot.
Right. So I'm Anshika. I'm the information manager for APAC Assistance. I will be talking about South China Sea to begin with, basically escalating tensions in South China Sea. The South China Sea has been a site of dispute for decades now. Everyone knows that there are disputes going on in international tribunals as well as in the territory itself, in the waters itself. The US and China have been meddling with each other in the disputed waters as well, even if they have not engaged in a direct confrontation. However, tensions have been growing between the two countries in the waters, outside of waters. We just spoke about a lot of it. Even with the ongoing trade war, with the banning of apps, with just China being aggressive on all fronts, including the US and India, and US just sort of calling it out on all of those fronts. In fact, last month itself, two aircraft carrier strike groups headed by USS Ronald Reagan and USS Nimitz were moved into South China Sea. And it's basically being seen as one of the largest military exercises in years. And this is at the same time China is holding its own drills around the Peninsular Islands. Not to say that China doesn't do this often, but US has clearly been more aggressive in sort of trying to counter Chinese claims in the sea. Now, the larger point I'm trying to make is that the interactions of these rival assets in the area would create chances of miscalculation and misjudgment, which could inevitably lead to accidental use of force, and which could potentially escalate the situation. Now, this is not to say that a war is imminent, but because South China Sea is increasingly becoming militarized because of presence of so many countries and so many countries engaged in conflicts, and US's increasing involvement in the region, there is a potential of accidental use of force and eventual escalation. Now, while the Chinese military is stepping up its activities, including patrols in the waters, the United States is also not sitting idly. US aircrafts have carried out 39 flights over waters near China since the beginning of this year, including flight operations in the South China Sea in mid-April. The US Navy has also ramped up its activity, conducting 4 freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea since Jan, compared to 8 total in 2019. Now they're clearly set to surpass last year's number. And I'll give you an example why this is big, because under Obama administration, there were only 2 to 3 of these, and now last year there were 8, and clearly this year US is set to surpass even this number. And now these patrols are basically US military ships deliberately cruising through waters that China has claimed jurisdiction over, to make a point that these are not legally under Beijing's control. So basically, both of the countries are acting very aggressive. China has China wasn't being as aggressive, but since US has also increased its freedom of navigation operations, even China is not backing off. Basically, none of the countries are willing to. The US has also supported some smaller states against China's increased military presence. I'll give you an example. In April this year, a Chinese vessel was sort of shadowing a Malaysian state contracted drill ship off Malaysian coast, and a US Navy vessel was shadowing the Chinese vessel, and it basically made the Chinese vessel back off, whereas Malaysia didn't invite it to do so. So basically, these things could eventually turn into something that even they wouldn't know because of just miscalculation and accidental use of force. Now, the Taiwan Strait is another site of dispute between the two nations. And because of Trump's basically stronger stance against China, America has decided that it will sail its ships through the Taiwan Strait once a month throughout the year. And they are even going to send a major warship on a port visit. And at the same time, Chinese military is, of course, not backing off either, and they have crossed the median line at least twice this year. The median line is basically the unofficial demarcation line between Taiwan and China. So that's happening. Now, to conclude the whole point, in the future, we could see Washington trying to retain its foothold in the Western Pacific by deepening its already existing alliances. It could also try to sort of resolve dangerous rifts between its allies. And at the same time, it is fearful of long-range missiles that that China has developed. So US could eventually increase the use of unmanned vessels, aircrafts, and deploy its own longer-range firepower in the South China Sea again, which would possibly increase interactions between these rival assets and could create a more tense atmosphere. So if anyone has any questions on South China Sea so far, please feel free to ask.
So obviously the South China Sea is very complex, very relevant. Is it jockeying for power? Are these significant, these movements? Are they going to affect the perception of companies that combine the South China Sea issue, the Hong Kong issue, the Korean Peninsular issue? Is it going to be another factor, Tony, that that has companies wanting to headquarter regionally elsewhere? They're questions I'm posing as opposed to about to offer any answers to, but they're all factors we need to be considering. Any other questions on that, or any other
Paul,
points
just
to make?
very briefly on that,
Yes.
obviously shippers would be worried about that, some form of disruption, because that would really create a problem for the supply chain.
Well, yes, I've been thinking about that. It could also be seen as there's a coincidental show of force going along. So certainly there's an element of deterrence to crime. So there's the two risks factor there. Obviously, some of those waters in the southern area of the South China Sea have a lot of piracy, so it probably will assist anti-piracy operations and the level of deterrence. But certainly from the chance of conflict or even scares, it could impact shipping, logistics, and certainly the perception of the stability there. But I think it is more about stability than the potential for conflict.
Yeah, agree. I think some of the major risk, and Anshika, I don't know if you looked at this yet, but if there was for instance, an accidental incident, or maybe in that in that short space of time there was some form of exchange of fire. And I can imagine that would be quickly stopped. But if that did happen, as we saw on the border, except on the border it wasn't an exchange of fire. But if there was a clash of some nature, that would disrupt the whole,
Yes.
shipping lanes. And I can imagine, being risk averse, there'd be many companies that wouldn't sail, vessels into those locations until, there was some form of agreement in place.
The other thing to mention there, Tony, is the clash on the India-China border when there's been a long agreement in place not to use weapons and people escalate using clubs and rocks. It's a lot easier to escalate than if it's involving nuclear-ready ships, and the disciplines of the commanders of a nuclear aircraft carrier, for example, is going to be a lot more disciplined in allowing escalation or use of force than the soldiers of China and India on the border, given the kind of presence of that somewhat dated law of no use of weapons. So I think we have to consider that as well, because yes, it would be, verging on catastrophic if there was some serious engagement of force. But I think we need to understand that escalation discipline's a lot bit more established. The relevant forces are trained. Yeah. So, Anshika, anything to add on Tony's point?
I mean that there isn't much to add, just the fact that, of course, there is a huge difference between, like you said, Paul, what happened in the India border, and with all of the capabilities that the US brings in the South China Sea and China brings as well. And again, it depends a lot on if Trump wins, because Biden apparently has a softer approach towards China, and that's the point Trump is even trying to sell. So if this continues, and if Trump wins, then it will definitely pose a risk to even ships, even other vessels passing through the area, because any accidental use of any use of firearm or any use of even missile, even if not just nuclear power, could escalate the issue, and that would pose a threat for a while at least.
Look, we're running out of time, so I might just ask you to progress on there, Anshika, onto the Korean Peninsula.
Right. So just to talk about that, I mean, that's another area that has been pretty tense for decades now, ever since the Korean War, so to say. But tensions have escalated in recent weeks. Now, this issue may seem minor to someone sitting in the West, but it's not minor. South Korean activists apparently sent some 500,000 leaflets, so which North Korea basically calls propaganda leaflets, in late May. It basically had content criticizing Kim Jong-un, and North Korea threatened to send 12 million such leaflets, and was basically very upset about the propaganda leaflets being sent from the South. Now, after this, North Korea basically cut off all cross-border communication lines with South Korea, and it even threatened to take steps to annul the 2018 deals that were basically made to ease tensions between the two countries. And eventually, when it didn't stop, North Korea actually destroyed an inter-Korean liaison office in the border town last month. And the incident occurred just hours after Kim Jong-un's sister had threatened to engage in military action at the border. And basically, following the demolition of the office, it was announced that Pyongyang will be deploying troops in the demilitarized areas. Now, this has sort of set back the talks that were ongoing, because South Korea has been trying to improve its ties with North Korea for a while. And these recent developments have set it back, even with US for that matter, because Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump met a little while ago, and everyone was hopeful that, the relationship may develop for good, and basically the issue may, if not subside, become slightly stable. Now, Kim Jong-un has completely refused to engage in any denuclearization negotiations as long as US clings to his hostile policies, by which basically means continues to put economic sanctions on North Korea. Now, US is talking with South Korea right now to discuss North Korea's strategy because of this. So these are the recent developments in the Korean Peninsula that I wanted to highlight, if anyone has questions.
I think there's an element of fatigue on the Korean Peninsula. It's very cyclic. I think we might just, Raga, I might have you cover off on just very quickly on the Indonesian resource sector, being cognizant that we're approaching the magical hour mark where everybody needs to go and get their bickies.
Sure, Paul. I'll try to make it short. I'll be talking about the Indonesia's resource sector. So Indonesia has a large variety of mineral deposits. Mining and the extraction of oil and natural gas accounts for around 1/10 of the country's GDP. Petroleum, natural gas, and coal constitute a major source of revenue, and they're primarily produced in Sumatra and Kalimantan and from offshore sites in the Java and South China Seas. The ownership of oil resources remains with the government of Indonesia, and the foreign companies act as contractors who supply the necessary capital. Since the last few decades, Indonesia has expanded its production of coal to become one of the world's largest exporters. The sale of liquefied natural gas has also become increasingly important. Indonesia is a resource-rich country, both in hydrocarbons and mining. However, it's worth mentioning that the oil production has substantially declined in the last 2 decades from its peak in 1995 to about 804,000 barrels of oil per day in 2017. So there's been a decline in production and a rapid increase in domestic consumption. So Indonesia is currently a net importer of oil. As of December 2018, oil and gas exports amounted to $1.3 billion, while imports amounted to $3 billion. There's a bunch of laws that have come in place that kind of apply to the natural resource sector, the omnibus laws especially. This is in mining, plantation, and environment. There have been a lot of discussions in the drafting process, considering that the natural resource sector, mainly in mining, has major implications for the environment and the livelihoods of many people. On May 12th of this year, Indonesia's parliament passed revisions to its mining law that allow miners to extend permits and seek expansion of mining areas beyond current legal limits. And mining companies have welcomed the new law. For example, PT Indica Energy has said that the law has given legal certainty to a coal industry that is inherently high risk and needs a lot of capital. Paul, I'm not sure if I have time to talk about the US-China context.
Yes, I think you do, but keep it a minute or two if you would.
Sure. So since the independence, Indonesia has maintained a relatively cooperative and mutually supportive relationship with the United States. The current security partnership is somewhat limited by Indonesia's operating and strategic capacities, as well as its desire to maintain a diverse range of relationships. Indonesia's relationship with China has seen very sharp shifts. And while Indonesia seeks to benefit from closer economic relations with economic rising China, the rise also underscores a persistent skepticism that is likely to remain a limiting factor. At a time when the global economy is seeing some of its darkest hours, the bilateral ties between the US and China have worsened, especially after the outbreak of COVID-19. Due to the mounting pressure of the trade war, major companies are relocating from China to other South Asian nations, and Indonesia is in talks with the US over possible relocation of such companies. Recently, it was announced that Indonesia is clearing up to 4,000 hectares of land in central Java to accommodate US companies, which are planning to relocate from China. For Indonesia, the desire to retain a stable supply chains and economic development work against provoking Beijing. Indonesia somewhat positions itself as an independent actor, and it will continue to seek trade with China and the United States. There are geopolitical tensions between the West, namely the US and Australia, and China in Indonesia. China has funded many infrastructure projects in Indonesia. This is with the intention to establish major nickel production companies in Sulawesi, among others. The prices of nickel have risen dramatically in the trade tensions between the US and China and are expected to increase further as Indonesia bans nickel exports. We've seen a departure from the domination of American investments in Indonesia. This is being replaced by enormous Chinese investments. It is so much that a majority of the investment is Chinese. China is likely to continue to make inroads into Indonesia, which could be quite unsettling for Indonesian skeptics as well as the West. That's it from me. Are there any questions? Well, Paul, I guess you can take it forward.
I'm sorry, I was muted. I want to add that there's the Central Sulawesi has a massive Chinese presence, and this is going to have impacts on the power plays of key individuals. Luhut, who's one of the most senior ministers in Indonesia, has been helping Chinese companies get literally thousands of people into Sulawesi. There's tensions growing by Indonesian employees against having so many unskilled workers. And the same is about to occur in Bangka, which is, of course, not far south of the Malacca Straits and a very important strategic area. So the China-Indonesia informal relationships with undesirable businessmen in Indonesia is a significant factor that we need to factor in when we're looking at the the Indonesia-China, Indonesia-USA tensions, but also industrial relations and FDI tensions. And we also need to be cognizant of the comprehensive economic partnering agreement with Australia and how that may further antagonise in low-skilled Indonesian workers and the unions. And I'm going to cut you off there, Rugger, because I want to just quickly have Mansi cover off on some of the COVID-related travel issues, if we could, as the final issue. If anyone needs to drop off, please just do so. We realise we've gone over time and we apologise. Mansi, would you mind doing that for me?
Sure, Paul. And yeah, I'm going to try and keep this short. So about border openings in East Asia Pacific, as everyone might know by now, that many countries in East Asia Pacific region are slowly opening up their borders, and some even have relaxed the lockdown restrictions within the respective countries. Some countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, and Malaysia have been relatively successful in containing the spread of COVID-19 infections within the country. In Thailand also, for example, the government has recently, not recently, but it has extended the state of emergency till July 31. And starting June 1, Thailand has allowed entry of foreign nationals who have work permits, and they have been given permission from Thai agents. They can apply for a permit to enter Thailand like a certificate of entry to the nearest Thai embassy or consulate. And this also includes foreign nationals who have a valid work permit and those who are spouses or parents of Thai citizens. And visitors who enter Thailand will be tested for COVID-19 before the trip and upon arrival in Thailand as well. So, and the visitors must present a negative test before flying. And Thailand has also recently lifted its international ban on international flight operations on July 1. And similarly in Singapore has opened its airports for transit, and it provides transit permits in Singapore. And all all foreign nationals in Singapore must ensure that they have a valid short-term visit pass. In Indonesia as well, the President Jokowi-led government has opted for a phased recovery plan. It has resumed business activities within the country, and the large-scale social restrictions, also called PSBB, are currently in effect in provinces with high rate of infections. Domestic and international travel has slowly opened up in Indonesia. And finally, to conclude this, in Malaysia, the government's strategy has been somewhat successful of the conditional movement control order. The government has allowed expatriate skilled workers and intellectual workers, including their families or dependents, to apply for an entry permit from like a Malaysian immigration or a Malaysian embassy. And guidance for the same for submitting an application is regularly updated on their websites. So that's it for me now. And if there are any questions, please go ahead and answer.
Okay, thanks. Look, I'll just stress, whilst you can apply to travel, there are currently, most countries are limiting numbers. So the application process can be frustrating to get an approval, and then the actual selection of a date can be a further frustration. That applies to several countries, chief of which is Thailand. So obviously there's a lot of people trying to get into Thailand because of its popularity from various aspects, but the practicality of it is not as easy as the regulations make out. Now, are there any questions of any nature on any particular issue that we've discussed or otherwise? Okay, if there's no questions, then look, thanks for your attendance. If anybody wants a recording of this session or the one we did on Indonesia on Tuesday, which was a very powerful session, please drop me an email, and we'll announce our next session. And we may drill in a couple of those points you raised, Tony, for our next session late next week or early the following week. Thanks everybody for your attendance, and Valachi in PNG will be in touch shortly for a one-on-one session with you, mate. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul and team.
And
Thanks, Paul.